What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about what I'm hoping to see from the Fable reboot a little later today, in fact, at Xbox's Developer Direct. So, this video is going live about 6 hours or so before the Xbox Developer Direct for 2026. Now, that is a little show from Xbox, of course, that is going to be covering Fable, as you would imagine, Forza Horizon 6, Beast of Reincarnation from Game Freak, which I'm also interested in seeing, and then there are rumors that there might be a fourth one, and given that they've shadow dropped things at this event before, that's not outside of the realm of possibility. However, the reason I wanted to talk about Fable specifically before the show actually started is that the Fable reboot was actually announced some time ago. It clearly hit some sort of development snag as they went pretty radio silent afterwards, and it's only at this Xbox Developer Direct here that we're actually getting some fresh information and gameplay. As you would probably imagine, given the nature of this video, there are certainly some things that I am hoping to see with those reveals, and we're about to talk about those obviously, but I did just want to point out towards the beginning of this video that the door is pretty wide open in terms of what they could potentially do with this reboot, because outside of a core couple of things, the initial 3 Fable games are not exactly impressive by today's standards. In fact, the first one, specifically the anniversary edition of it, is actually my personal favorite of the original trilogy, whereas Fable 2 kind of improved on some things and took a step back in others for me, and then Fable 3 is a pretty bad game, honestly. Like, it has its moments, but a not insubstantial amount of that game is pretty terrible. And if I had to sum up the original trilogy personally, I think I would describe it as a lot of promise and interesting ideas that never quite coalesced into like a full, complete vision, if you will. And so, if you want my honest opinion, I don't think it would be terribly difficult to outdo the original 3 games, but realistically, I think that is honestly kind of a low bar. As mentioned, I would like to see them go a little farther than that, and hopefully incorporate some other stuff and really try to push this into being something special, because the core idea of Fable, things like your character and the world changing as you interact with it, are inherently interesting ideas, even if the technology wasn't quite there at the time, as the third game in the series, released in 2010 to give you a point of reference. And that is, for starters, kind of the thing that I'm hoping they manage to keep here. But to me, that basically comes down to a few different things that I want to then break down and talk about individually. But first and foremost, making a character and then watching that character evolve as a consequence of your choices. Now, in the original games, mind you, this was basically just a series of ways your character would change as a result of certain ways you built that character. Like, you increase strength, you get more muscles, you can potentially get taller if you're leveling up like skill, or if you go into magic, your body parts might glow, or you might get tattoos, and then based on whether you're doing good or bad things, you might get a halo or horns, that type of stuff. And those were fun ideas, if a bit limited at the time. And I think retaining some of that core identity there is really, really important, but I would like to see them take it a step farther and actually add a full-blown character editor this time, or a character creation segment, if you will, as that is not something the originals had. Another aspect of these games was their very, I would say, tongue-in-cheek sort of humor. All 3 of the Fable games had a very specific brand of humor, and I'm curious to see if all these years later that fresh developers can actually translate that into something. Some of their trailers gave me some hope for that, but that's the kind of thing that until you see the whole game, you just don't know. But I think that humor is really important to what the series is. And then 2 other things I want to talk about here. Believe it or not, landlording is kind of important. There's a whole little real estate mini game that kind of goes on in the background of all of these games. In fact, a sort of perfect solution to your problems in number 3, or you could just be an awful or really good person as a result of it in 1 or 2. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But then finally, combat, as you would imagine, plays a role in the original games, but given the nature of them, outside of the first game, they kind of moved away from, I would say, any real depth. In fact, in 3, it's impossible to die. If you lose all your health, you just lose some experience and get right back up. Like, it's literally impossible to lose. And this is one of the reasons I like the first game so much, because there was like a proper experience system, and you could die, as an example. But regardless of like the specifics, building a character that could participate in combat via the skills you acquired, which kind of went into morphing that character as well, is important, especially these days where a game with bad combat isn't necessarily dead on arrival, but people will definitely put a knock on your game for it. So I think evolving those is actually going to be pretty important. And then last but not least, a release date isn't necessarily required, but I would certainly enjoy one given how long we've been kind of waiting on this at this point. We'll see what happens there, I suppose. Now, to talk about these a little on the individual side, starting with the character creation bit. So again, these are not games that ever had a character creator. At most, you would basically pick boy or girl, and that was pretty much it. And then what happened to your character afterward was just a consequence of those things. But what I would like to see, though what I would imagine is also not exactly a simple thing to do, is a sort of combination of those systems. I think actually getting to make your own character in a game like this would go a long way for just kind of getting people attached to it. But that does come with the, I would say, difficult proposition of then putting yourself in a position where that character could, say, grow and evolve as a consequence of your choices, like all the different ways those things might affect a model in game, as an example. You know, the strength, the height, all this other stuff, and the issues that could potentially lead to. That's not nothing. But if we're really going to reboot the franchise, I think that's probably one of the biggest asks I would have for this game personally. Next up, that sense of humor. As mentioned, the trailers and stuff they've put out previously have kind of, I would say, alleviated some worries here, but the original 3 Fable games had a very specific sense of humor, which relates no doubt to the fact that it was a British game, but a lot of it was, very tongue-in-cheek, a little bawdy at times perhaps, while also letting you do some truly depraved things, but also making it like a little funny at the same time. Like sacrificing people at the Temple of Scorn only for you to and get a reward obviously for it, but also hear the terrible puns that the guys who run the temple will tell you as you sacrifice these people. So I really do think it's important that that humor manages to make it in there. I think that's a not insignificant part of Fable's identity. But then there's that sort of real estate aspect to those games as well. So in the first game, there were houses you could buy that were always available, but then if you wanted to buy other property, what you'd have to do is go in and just kill the owners, basically. Now, this was possible. If you played an evil character, of course, you could just walk into a town, kill everybody there, and buy up all their property. The second game made this a little easier just by allowing you to just buy more stuff, basically, without having to do that, and the third game did this as well. Now, this has always been a really fantastic way to make money, because typically rent would come due every few minutes, and in some of the originals, I think you could even advance the time on the console to make use of that. But in the third game, there is essentially a perfect ending, if you will, in terms of being a good person, and money is what allows you to do that. And so exploiting the game's rental property system in order to make that money on your own rather than rely on the decisions you would have to make played a pretty crucial role in that. And while I think it would be, I would say, relatively easy enough to put in another system like that here, where you could, buy up property, potentially fix them up, and more or less carbon copy what those originals did. But while I certainly wouldn't hate that, to be honest with you, it's just kind of a fun thing in its own way. I think if they really wanted to take it farther, the obvious thing here is some sort of town building mechanic, which isn't everybody's cup of tea, but I think in this specific instance, it would actually make sense if and only if they were to go all in on it, fully let you customize that town and, focus in on what they're trading and the local economy and all this stuff. Basically these elements that were in the other games and really just kind of double down on them. I don't think this necessarily needs to be in there to be a good game, but just because of what a core aspect of those original 3 it wound up being, I would love to see something like that personally. So there's that. But last but not least, we've then got the combat and magic systems. Now, truth be told, combat in general was never the strong suits of the original 3 games. Personally, one of the reasons I enjoyed the first game more than the other 2 is because I think the combat felt the best there. In no small part due to the way the magic system worked. In the original game, basically you would just learn a spell and then be able to cast it so long as you had the mana to do so. This meant you could get a lot of really overpowered stuff and spam it, which was honestly a pretty fun way to play the game, and then you could potentially mix and match certain bits of spells, and that was fun. 2 and 3 then went on to change that, 2 using like this charge system, and then 3 using like this glove system, and it was all right, but it also like vastly simplified the amount of stuff you even had available compared to the first game. In some cases it did like combine the effects, but basically it just kind of felt like a weird step back to me personally, though I do know some people preferred that system. However, no matter how you slice it, the combat of those original games is just very dated by comparison to almost anything today, in fact. But while I don't think combat in games like the original Fable titles that are kind of dependent upon the character you built are necessarily ever going to be as in-depth as something like a Souls-like game, as an example, there's gotta be some sort of middle ground. Honestly, for starters, just increasing weapon variety would go a long way. The original games were a little limited on the actual weapons you could use, which was supposed to come down to you being like a hero, etc. They kind of mixed this up as the games advanced with like technology and everything, which is another thing. We don't necessarily know the level of technology we'll be working with in this reboot, mind you, but basically your options there were limited, and just expanding the pool of what you could potentially use in combat would honestly be a big step forward just in and of itself. However, adding things like, some actual impact, in-depth melee mechanics outside of, just like a regular or heavy attack with a block on occasion. Maybe if they want to get crazy, even add some directional stuff in there, and then combine that with a magic system that was engaging in some way, I think would honestly be enough. But long story short, just a better combat system than those originals. And I'm not super picky about the how, which does sort of bring us to the conclusion of this particular video. Basically, I think the original Fable series, again, had just a lot of promise and interesting ideas that never quite came to fruition. And while, as a content creator, I'm pretty much always going to check out something like a Fable Reboot, however, I do think it's also an opportunity to potentially deliver on those things that the original series was trying to deliver on. So regardless of whatever actually winds up being in the game, zooming out a little bit, that is my hope. That said, as this is going up not all that long before the show itself, you can obviously at some point probably tell me all about it in the comments below, which is as good a time as any to mention that you should like, comment, subscribe, and then after the show I'll give a rundown of what we actually saw there. Fable and Beast of Reincarnation being of personal interest to me, and then if any surprises are in there, we'll talk about those as well. But for the moment, that is pretty much going to do it. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.